Welcome to this evening on our walk through the Psalms, 150 days of Psalms. We are now today on week 12. We are going to be looking at one of the Psalms from Psalm 78 to Psalm 84. And I'm Victor Spencer. I'm an elder here at Living Hope Church. And I welcome you to join us tonight on this July 22nd, 2020. So, this week I got to choose which of the 7 Psalms to work with, and I chose the longest one, which happens to be Psalm 78. In this psalm we have 72 verses, and this particular psalm is a maskil of Asaph. A maskil, if you look it up, is a poem, and this particular poem is a psalm that is to instruct the people. It's a psalm of instruction. So as we read through this, I see a whole lot of sections. But just to put a preface on this, it appears that this psalm was written at the time when David had brought the ark from the city, from the tent of meeting in Shiloh down to Jerusalem. And so this psalm is written around this time. But this psalm is also a psalm of instruction, and it is to implore the people to teach the children about God and about His interaction with the people so they can set their hope in God. Okay? And if I were to give any admonishment, and I'll probably remember this at the end of this meeting, of this teaching, I'll probably say this again. If we have an opportunity as people in our generation, and we have generations coming up after us, that it would be beneficial, one, to let them see the Word of God and know what God has done for the people of Israel and see how He interacts and see His character as He interacts with mankind through history. And the people of Israel had interactions with the Lord, and we got to see what makes Him glad and what makes Him happy, what makes Him angry, what brings judgment, and how holy He is, and how good He is. And so we get to see these things, and the psalmist brings these out in this psalm in particular. But as we implore the generations that are coming after us, it is also our duty to teach these things to our children and to those who are with us coming. And so I would like to admonish you to take your personal testimony and allow that testimony to let your children know it and to let the people who are around you know it, to strengthen their faith and see how God has interacted with you in your life and the goodness that He has brought to you. So let's get started with this psalm. So Asaph wants to capture the attention of the audience in his first section, verse 1 through 4. And so he has some hard language that says, listen, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and read. Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from old. Things that we have heard and known, that our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, but tell them to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and His might, and the wonders He has done. All right, so he captures the attention. He wants to talk about the wonders that God has done here. The second section is an admonishment not to forget to teach these things to the children generation by generation so that they can set their hope in God. Verses 5 through 7. He established a testimony in Jacob, and Jacob being the second son of Isaac, who becomes Israel as his life progresses, as he walks with the Lord. And his children then are called the children of Israel. And the nation of Israel is based on Jacob. So he establishes a testimony in Jacob. A testimony, you may also have a testimony established in your life that you would like to bring to your children to make sure they at least know it so that maybe their faith can be grounded in something. All right. He established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers to teach to their children, that the next generation might know them, the children yet unborn, and arise to tell their children, so that they should set their hope in God, and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. The previous psalm before this that Asaph wrote mentions that as he was going through a dark time, when he was looking for something to console him, he started meditating on all the things God had done, and he found great comfort in that. And so here in this next psalm, he is trying to produce, or it's possible that he is trying to help the nation of Israel find that same way to comfort themselves through the great works of God. So we are going to go on to verse 8 here. We have 8 through 11 is kind of sets the footing for the next sections. This is almost like a charge against the previous generation that was around Eli's time, the generation after Eli. And so he mentions them here, and he mentions them near the end after he gives a center section that talks about how God worked with the fathers in Egypt, how they sinned, and how he went along, he forbore their sins, and he worked with them and didn't wipe them out. Is one way to say it, but this next section starts with the Ephraimites and then moves on. So I'm going to read verses 8 through 11. The Ephraimites, armed with a bow, turned back on the day of battle. Verse 8. All right. And so it says that the children should keep their commandments, and that they should not be, like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not steadfast, whose spirit was not faithful to God. Now he starts with the Ephraimites in verse 9. The Ephraimites, armed with the bow, turned back on the day of battle. They did not keep God's covenant, but refused to walk according to his law. They forgot his works and the wonders that he had shown them. If we look in Romans chapter 1, we find that as Paul gives in verse 20, he talks about how the people knew God, but then they forgot, they weren't thankful to God. And then they turned from worshiping the true God who created everything to worshiping created things. And so there's a progression of failure there in Romans chapter 1, where they completely lost the knowledge of God. They had the knowledge of God, but they were not thankful. Then they turned from worshiping God to worshiping created things, and then they lost it all. And here we see the same thing. They forgot his works and the wonders that he had shown them. And so I think the point we need to get is that we have all, if we are Christians, our walk, however it was, has ended up with the hand of the Lord moving our steps along the way. And those steps are very glorious. And how I got here was just amazing. And so you can let your children know those things, so that they won't forget why you believe. In the sight of their fathers, he performed miracles in the land of Egypt, in the fields of Zoan. Zoan was the capital at the time, which was on the bank of the Nile. It was the capital of Egypt. He divided the sea and let them pass through it. He made the waters stand like a heap In the daytime, he led them with a cloud, and all the night with a fiery light. He split rocks in the wilderness and gave them drink abundantly as from the deep. He made streams come out of the rock, and he caused the waters to flow down like rivers. I think he emphasizes how much water came out so that it wasn't just a little bit, but it was abundant, right? Now, verse 17 through 29, he brings into focus a particular story of the failing of the children of Israel. And for some reason, he emphasizes this particular story above all other failings. And the core of it appears to be that the people were grumbling and complaining about not having a variety, not having the luxury of meat. They only had manna, which he calls here the food of the angels. And literally that is translated the bread of the mighty. So he brings this particular sin out, which I believe is something that this generation believes was part of the problem with the generation of Ephraimites who lost the Ark of the Covenant. So, here in verse 17, we'll start. So he gave them all these things. They saw they had water abundantly, yet they still they sinned more against him, rebelling against the Most High in the desert. They tested God in their heart by demanding food they craved. They spoke against God, saying, "Can God spread a table in the wilderness?" In their hearts, they tested God. God knows the hearts, and he knew their hearts. And they were complaining about the manna being the only food source. He struck the rock so that water gushed out and streams overflow. He also gave them bread. Can he also give them bread or provide meat for his people? That's the question the people are asking. So they spoke against God, saying, "Can God spread a table in the wilderness? He struck the rock so that water gushed out and streams overflowed. Can he also give bread or provide meat for his people?" And here we go in verse 21 we talk about this story. Therefore, when the Lord heard, he was full of wrath. A fire was kindled against Jacob. His anger rose against Israel, because they did not believe in God and did not trust his saving power. Yet he commanded the skies above and opened the doors of heaven, and he rained down on them manna to eat and gave them the grain of heaven. Man ate the bread of the angels. He sent them food in abundance. He caused the east wind to blow in the heavens, and by his power he led them out the south wind. And by his power he led out the south wind. He rained meat on them like dust, winged birds like the sand of the seas. He let them fall in the midst of their camp, all around their dwellings. And they ate and were filled, and he gave them what they craved. But before they had satisfied their craving, while the food was still in their mouths, the anger of God rose against them, and he killed the strongest of them and laid low the young men of Israel. In spite of all this, they still sinned, and despite of his wonders, they did not believe. All right, we're going to take a pause here. This is the consequence of their craving the meat and the lust for food. They didn't have a variety, and so they got tired of the manna. They wanted meat. The Lord provided meat, but their hearts were still when they got it, they stuffed themselves. The Lord, and the Lord, there was a consequence for this. A lot of them died. All right. Now we go back. He's going to go back and reiterate and bring out the specific miracles that he did when. So here he said they did not believe. They still did not believe, right? Even after this. And so he's going to talk about the goodness of God, and he's going to go through and talk about specific things that he had done for them. All right? So let's look at that. So he made their days vanish like a breath, and their years in terror. When he killed them, they sought him. They repented and sought God earnestly. They remembered that God was their rock, the Most High God, their Redeemer. But they flattered him with their mouths, and they lied to him with their tongues. Their heart was not steadfast toward him, and they were not faithful to his covenant. Yet he, being compassionate, atoned for their iniquity and did not destroy them. He restrained his anger often and did not stir up all his wrath. He remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passes and comes not again. How often they rebelled against him in the wilderness and grieved him in the desert. They tested God again and again and provoked the Holy One of Israel. They did not remember his power or the day when he redeemed them from the foe. So here again we see the idea of they did not remember. And so this psalm is trying to make sure that people do remember these dark tidings. So here is the dark tidings. The way that constantly they rebelled against God, they grumbled, they complained, and they were punished, but God never destroyed them. He did not stir up all of his wrath, right? Okay. They did not remember his power on the day when he redeemed them from the foe, and when he performed his signs in Egypt and his marvels in the fields of Zoan. He turned their rivers to blood so that they could not drink their streams. He sent among them swarms of flies which devoured them, and frogs which destroyed them. He gave their crops to the destroying locust, and their fruit of their labor to the locust, and the fruit of their labor to the locust. He destroyed their vines with hail, and their sycamores with frost. He gave over their cattle to hail, and their flocks to thunderbolts. He let loose on them his burning anger, wrath, indignation, and distress, a company of destroying angels. He made a path for his anger. He did not spare them from death, but he gave their lives over to the plague. He struck down every firstborn in Egypt, the first fruits of their strength in the tents of Ham. So you might ask me, what are the tents of Ham, Vic? Well, the author here is telling us that he sees the Egyptian people as descendants of Noah's third son, Ham. So they lived in Egypt. Then he led out his people like sheep and guided them in the wilderness like a flock. He led them in safety so they were not afraid, but the sea overwhelmed their enemies, and he brought them to his holy land, to the mountain which his right hand had won. He drove out the nations before them. He appointed them for a possession and settled the tribes of Israel in their tents. And so here is where he's reminding everyone of the goodness of God for their fathers. And he brings them out of Egypt and all of these miracles that they had seen. And we reflect back on the first part of this passage where in all of those times they sinned over and over and over again, and they forgot the things God had done just prior. And so here we transition. He says, and yet they tested and rebelled against the Most High God and did not keep his testimonies, but turned away and acted treacherously like their fathers. So their fathers did these things while they were coming through out of Egypt. After they came out of Egypt, they had that specific thing with the quail. And that point that he brings up, it looked like they were grumbling about not having enough variety or enough luxury or enough good things. And so he goes back and he reminds us of all the good things their fathers had seen. And now they're in Israel. And he says, yet they tested and rebelled against Moses, against the Most High God, and did not keep his testimonies, but turned away and acted treacherously like their fathers. And now he's actually here, has come in time to the point where he's talking about Ephraim's failure with the Ark of the Covenant and during that generation. So I believe that right here he's talking in this paragraph. Yet they tested and rebelled against the Most High God. They did not keep his commandments, but turned away and acted treacherously like their fathers. They twisted like a deceitful bow. So if you're an archer and you pull your string and you notch your arrow and the bow twists on you, that would not be a good thing. So they twisted like a deceitful bow. For they provoked him to anger with their high places. So in those times, people would go and set up idols and places of worship on the tops of mountains where they were close to heaven. And so here is a constant theme that Israel and the peoples of the whole world, not just Israel, but the whole world did these kinds of things. They would go up and set up idols. The next verse talks about, and they moved him to jealousy with their idols. When God heard, he was full of wrath, and he utterly rejected Israel. Now, this is sort of important. He forsook his dwelling at Shiloh, the tent where he had dwelt among mankind. So when they came to Israel, the tent of meeting was set up in the place called Shiloh, and this was for all of Israel. But here he says he rejected Israel at this time, and this is why this is talking about the generation of Ephraim. So he forsook his dwelling at Shiloh, the tent where he had dwelt amongst mankind, and delivered his power to captivity, his glory to the hand of the foe. And this is referencing the Ark of the Covenant being lost to the Philistines. He gave his people over to the sword and vented his wrath on his heritage. Now, this particular failure was the closest one to the time of David, and so it's probably in the minds of the people of Israel as they bring the Ark of the Covenant from where it had returned out of captivity. As they bring that down to Jerusalem, this is talking about that loss of the ark. So after that, apparently during that battle, there was great retribution from the Philistines, and it talks about what that looked like in these next few verses. So he gave his glory over to the hand of foe in verse 61. Verse 62, he gave his people over to the sword and vented his wrath on his heritage. Fire devoured their young men, and their young women had no marriage songs. Their priests fell by the sword, and their widows made no lamentation. All right, and so here we have a pause in time, and now they're going to jump to this time. And so now this section, starting in verse 65, this is where God restores Israel, and he passes the blessing from Joseph. Joseph was one of the last sons. He wasn't the last son. Benjamin was one of his sons, but it takes the blessing from Ephraim was one of the sons of Joseph. And so Joseph he didn't have a tribe, but his two sons made two tribes. So Ephraim was one of the tribes, And so it's talking about passing the Ark of the Covenant from Ephraim and bringing it to Judah. The Lord awoke and this is verse 65 again. Then the Lord awoke as from sleep, like a strong man shouting because of wine, and he put his adversaries to rout. He put them to everlasting shame. He rejected the tent of Joseph. He did not choose the tribe of Ephraim, but he chose the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion, which he loves. He built his sanctuary like the high heavens, like the earth, which he has founded forever. So his sanctuary is founded forever. He chose David his servant. He took him from the sheepfolds, and from following the nursing ewes, he brought him to shepherd Jacob his people, Israel his inheritance. With upright heart he shepherded them and guided them with his skillful hand. And this closes that psalm of instruction. We see here the archetype of Christ in David. And we see David came from humble beginnings to become the shepherd over his inheritance, which is the nation of Israel, right? We see this. Jesus also became a shepherd during his time from humble beginnings. He goes on to be the Lord of all, right? So it's a picture of that transition, and it is very possible that if you are in humble beginnings, the Lord will be able to use you in leadership later. So So we see here that we get to see a picture of what makes the Lord angry, what makes the Lord happy, that his good love and his promises endure even across our sinful, the sinful things we do in our personal life, in a national way as well. The Lord is good. And so here at this point, I would say, if you have a chance to somehow put your testimony, your personal testimony, and think on all of the places where the Lord has done something in your life, that you could then impart that to those who are coming after you. And remember that, and remember what God has done when you're in the low places, and how great his love has been in your life. I believe that you will capture the heart of this instructional psalm. Thank you for being with us tonight, and we will hopefully see you next week on week 13. Yes, I'm done.